Representative Omar, I have one straightforward inquiry for you to answer today. Let us imagine a hypothetical war between the United States and Somalia. So tell me which side you would desire to see victorious. The voice of Speaker Mike Johnson sliced through the atmosphere of the Ethics Committee room with the precision of a surgical blade, cold and exacting. It was not the posturing tone of a politician seeking a quick clip for the evening news cycle. It was the calculated tone of a constitutional attorney who had spent half a year constructing a snare and had just snapped it shut. An absolute and suffocating silence instantly filled the entire chamber. Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table flanked by her high-priced defense counsel, with a barricade of binders and folders positioned before them. For the previous 6 hours, she had successfully deflected questions and launched counterattacks against the proceedings. She had labeled the entire hearing a partisan witch hunt and a shameful misuse of public funds, appearing defiant and occasionally even bored. However, this specific question was entirely different because it stripped away all nuance and complex foreign policy defenses. It presented a stark binary choice of yes or no, demanding she choose between us or them, and everyone present realized she was unable to answer. The silence dragged on, transforming into a physical weight that pressed down on the chests of all who were watching. The cameras zoomed in close, broadcasting every tiny twitch of her face in high definition to the world. They captured the moment her eyes darted frantically toward her attorney, silently begging for an objection that never arrived. They recorded her knuckles turning white as she gripped the mahogany table, and the way she opened her mouth only to close it again, realizing any word she spoke would be fatal. In the high-stakes world of television, a full minute of dead air feels like an eternity and functions essentially as a confession. The hearing room was jammed to its absolute limit, with every single seat occupied and the press gallery overflowing. Reporters were sitting on the floor in the aisles while members of Congress from both parties stood along the back walls. Everyone had anticipated that this hearing would be significant, given that Speaker Johnson rarely led committees personally unless the situation was historic. Yet, nobody had predicted this methodical and quiet destruction of a sitting Congresswoman unfolding in real time. Johnson remained motionless at the head of the table, offering no gloating smile or sign of triumph. His hands rested neatly atop a thick black binder, while behind him stood easels displaying charts and photos revealed throughout the day. To his right sat the chief counsel and investigators, while to his left sat the Republican committee members. The Democrats had boycotted the event, labeling it a political hit job, but that decision now appeared to be a catastrophic strategic blunder. The empty seats did not make the proceedings look illegitimate, but rather made them appear strictly judicial and devoid of partisan shouting. Without the usual interruptions and grandstanding, the room felt less like a political circus and more like a solemn courtroom prosecution. Omar wore a bright turquoise hijab and a sharp blazer, clearly dressed to make a statement for the cameras. She had expected a viral moment where she stood up to the patriarchy and spoke truth to power. She had survived severe attacks on her character before, including threats and accusations of bigotry, always emerging as a martyr for her cause. But Johnson was not attacking her identity or her faith. He was simply presenting the undeniable receipts of her actions. Johnson finally broke the heavy silence without raising his voice, as he had no need to shout. He offered to rephrase the inquiry to make it even simpler for the Congresswoman to understand. He reminded her that upon becoming a citizen, she stood in a federal building and swore to entirely renounce all allegiance to any foreign power. Leaning forward with his eyes locked on hers, he emphasized that she had sworn allegiance solely to the United States. He asked if she truly meant that oath when she took it, or if she had been lying from the very beginning. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper urgently in her ear, his face draining of color as the gravity of the situation set in. She shook her head slightly in response, her lips barely moving as the microphones picked up the urgent murmuring, but not the specific words. Johnson waited patiently, knowing he had all the evidence he needed and could sit there forever if necessary. Finally, Omar spoke, but her voice, usually so commanding, sounded strained and incredibly thin. She stammered that it was a loaded question presenting a false dichotomy that failed to reflect the complexity of her situation. Johnson interrupted calmly, correcting her like a teacher instructing a student, noting it is only a loaded question if one cannot answer it honestly. He stated that every American in the room would immediately know which side they supported if their home was at war. He asked why she could not simply say she wanted America to win, and silence descended once again. The trap had snapped shut because saying America would contradict the secret recordings of her pledging loyalty to Somali officials. Saying Somalia would be an admission of treason on live television, stripping her of both her citizenship and her seat in Congress. Her silence screamed the answer louder than any words could, and Johnson noted that her inability to answer told them everything. He explained she could not claim loyalty to America because 6 hours of evidence proved she worked for Somalia's interests. They had seen the bank records, heard the audio tapes, and analyzed her voting record. Yet she could not claim loyalty to Somalia either, as that would be admitting she lied during her citizenship oath. Johnson let the weight of the moment settle before concluding that her refusal to speak was, in itself, an answer. Omar suddenly stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor as her composure finally cracked. She shouted that this was a witch hunt and Islamophobia disguised as oversight, her voice shaking with rage and panic. She claimed she was being persecuted for being a black Muslim woman daring to speak truth to power. Johnson did not blink or change his expression, simply ordering the Congresswoman to sit down. When she yelled that she would not sit because she represented her people, Johnson cut through her shouting with icy precision. He stated clearly that this had nothing to do with her race or religion, but entirely with her actions. It was about documented evidence of foreign agent activity and money received from foreign government sources. It was about phone calls where she coordinated with foreign officials to undermine the policy of the United States. He repeated the order to sit down, and she eventually complied because the sergeant-at-arms had stepped forward. She sat because she had no choice, and because her lawyer was pulling desperately on her sleeve to silence her. Johnson selected a single document from his binder to show everyone exactly what the investigation had uncovered. He identified it as a phone transcript from an NSA intercept recorded in March of the current year. Holding the paper up, he read her exact words where she told the Somali foreign minister she would always prioritize Somalia's interests. The quote revealed she considered America merely the place where she worked, while her first loyalty remained elsewhere. Johnson asked the room to let that quote hang in the air, emphasizing the phrase about America being just a workspace. He noted with disgust that she spoke as if she were a foreign agent who simply happened to have a security clearance. To understand how the third-ranking Muslim in Congress ended up unable to support America in a war, one must rewind the clock. You have to go back 8 hours to when Ilhan Omar walked into her office building believing she was untouchable. It was morning, 8 hours before the silence, and Representative Omar sat in her suite surrounded by the symbols of her power. She was relaxed and scrolling through social media, sipping coffee across from her chief of staff and her attorney. She chuckled as she read a tweet, telling her team that the opposition had absolutely nothing on her. She believed her base was already mobilized against what they called a racist show trial and expected to raise $1 million by noon. She reasoned that if Johnson had anything real, it would have leaked to the press months ago. Her lawyer agreed, flipping through anticipated questions and dismissing the subpoena as a standard fishing expedition. They planned to stonewall on sensitive issues and use the Democratic boycott to delegitimize the entire proceeding. Her chief of staff was confident in their media strategy, planning to frame any questions about Somalia as attacks on refugees. If money was mentioned, they would claim compliance, and if foreign policy came up, they would pivot to free speech. Omar nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline, boasting that she had survived worse attacks from Trump and McCarthy. She stood up to check her reflection, looking powerful and ready for battle. She had no idea she was walking into a slaughter just 3 blocks away in the Speaker's office. Inside the Capitol, the atmosphere was entirely different, with no laughter or casual scrolling through phones. Mike Johnson sat at his desk acting not like a politician, but like a prosecutor preparing for a murder trial. As a constitutional lawyer, he understood the rules of evidence and the burden of proof required to make a case stick. Across from him sat the committee's chief counsel, a former federal attorney who had spent decades putting corrupt officials behind bars. The counsel confirmed quietly that they were ready, with every claim sourced and every piece of evidence prepared for court. Johnson reviewed the 4 color-coded binders containing financial evidence, communications intercepts, voting records, and witness statements. He asked to go through the sequencing one last time to ensure the trap was completely unavoidable. The counsel outlined Phase 1, which would establish that her campaigns received millions from sources tied to the Somali government. They would trace the shell companies to show it was not just donations, but active money laundering. Phase 2 would introduce the FISA warrants, utilizing 43 intercepted calls between her and Somali officials regarding legislation. Phase 3 would overlay the money with her voting record, showing she voted against U.S. interests immediately after receiving payments. Then came Phase 4, the witnesses, which the counsel described as the ultimate kill shot for her defense. 3 Somali-American constituents who were registered Democrats were willing to testify under oath about her private statements. One of them had recorded a conversation where Omar claimed her heart and loyalty should always be to Somalia. Johnson confirmed the recording was admissible because Minnesota is a one-party consent state, making the evidence devastating. The plan was to ask the simple question of where her loyalty lay, forcing her into a paradox. If she answered America, she would contradict the tapes and witnesses, committing perjury. If she answered Somalia, she would admit to citizenship fraud and treason, and if she refused, that silence would be the headline. Johnson closed the briefing book, feeling the heavy responsibility of dismantling a colleague rather than just winning a news cycle. He emphasized that tone was everything, instructing that they must remain clinical and professional, letting the facts speak for themselves. At 9:30 in the morning, Omar walked out flanked by her political allies, cameras flashing to project strength. She stopped at a microphone to declare the hearing a disgrace and a desperate attempt to silence dissent. Mike Johnson entered the hearing room alone through a side door, carrying only his black binder and ignoring the cameras. He sat at the head of the table, checked his watch, and banged the gavel exactly on time. He announced that the House Committee on Ethics was in session to investigate violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Omar sat across from him with a slight smirk, thinking she was ready for a fight without realizing she was already in checkmate. Johnson informed her she had the right to counsel and the right to refuse to answer. Though inferences could be drawn, after she acknowledged her rights, he offered her the chance to make an opening statement. She stood up immediately, smoothing her blazer and looking directly into the television cameras to deliver her prepared clip. She condemned the hearing as political persecution, targeting her identity and her criticism of foreign policy. She spoke with practiced emotion about coming to the country as a refugee and working hard to serve her community. She claimed her actions were legally advocating for policies that help immigrants and opposing destabilizing interventions. Her supporters in the gallery began to applaud, the noise growing from a smattering to a roar. Johnson allowed it for exactly 4 seconds before banging the gavel and threatening to clear the room. Omar sat down looking confident, believing she had successfully framed the narrative as the bully versus the refugee. Johnson waited for silence, thanked her politely, and then said the 6 words that began her destruction. "Let us look at the evidence." He distributed copies of documents from his red binder to the committee and the defense counsel. He began with campaign finance, noting that her entities had raised nearly $9 million since 2018. He pointed out that over $1 million of that sum came from sources directly tied to the Somali government. When he asked if she was aware of this, she tried to deflect by citing general compliance with regulations. Johnson gently interrupted, asking specifically if she knew significant funding came from government-linked sources. He displayed a document showing the Somali American Leadership Council was her largest single organizational donor. When Omar claimed it was a legitimate American organization, Johnson agreed it was incorporated here, but questioned the source of its money. A flowchart on the screen revealed that 87% of the council's funding came from a bank in Mogadishu. He explained that the bank was controlled by the brother of Somalia's finance minister, linking the money directly to the government. He asked where the money was really coming from when that council donated to her campaign. Her lawyer argued that the organization was a registered entity, and his client followed disclosure requirements. Johnson asked if she disclosed that the source was a foreign government bank, noting the silence in the room. He then produced a document from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network tracking unusual money flows. It showed large wire transfers from Mogadishu coinciding exactly with U.S. election cycles and subsequent donations to her campaign. Johnson stated the pattern repeated through 2024, indicating this was foreign money laundered to fund her political career. When Omar protested that she could not vet every donor's bank records, Johnson produced a photo of her with the bank's chairman. He noted that witnesses heard the chairman introduce her as their voice in Congress and the representative for the homeland. He asked skeptically if she truly didn't know he was connected to the government, leaving her with no good answer. The narrative of a witch hunt was crumbling under the weight of specific wire transfers and bank records. Johnson then turned to the financial activities of her husband and his company, Sahan Services Group. He read from disclosures stating the company received substantial consulting fees from Somali businesses. When asked what services the company provided, Omar stiffened, insisting her husband was a private citizen. Johnson reminded her they filed joint tax returns, meaning his income was effectively her income. He pointed out that investigators found the company had no website, no other clients, and no employees other than her husband. A new graphic appeared on the screen showing a timeline of payments alongside her voting record. Johnson explained that every single payment to the company arrived within 2 weeks of her voting on legislation related to Somalia. He walked through the specific dates, showing payments followed immediately by votes against sanctions or conditions on aid. Johnson stated plainly that these were not consulting fees but payments for her votes, defining it as corruption. The room erupted with gasps and shouts of bribery, until Johnson banged the gavel to restore order. Omar stood up, trembling with rage. claiming this was speculation attacking her family because he could not attack her record. Johnson ordered her to sit, stating that 8 instances constitute a clear pattern of evidence, not a coincidence. He asserted that any federal prosecutor would take this quid pro quo case to a jury immediately. Moving to the blue binder, he shifted the focus from money to her coordination with foreign officials. He cited FBI counts showing she had documented contact with Somali officials 127 times in 4 years. He noted this was more contact than most State Department officials have, and while some was routine, 43 calls were not. Producing a redacted transcript, he revealed she had discussed U.S. policy, pending votes, and classified briefings with them. He stated they had the transcripts of her sharing strategic matters, leaving the room reeling. Johnson then called a witness named Amina Hassan to the stand to hear from the people themselves. A woman in a modest dress and hijab entered, looking not like a political operative, but like a nervous neighbor. Amina testified that she was a U.S. citizen who came as a refugee and worked as a pediatric nurse. She confirmed she lived in Omar's district and had proudly voted for her in previous elections. When asked what changed her mind, she described a town hall meeting where she asked about assimilation programs. She testified that Omar got angry and told the room that assimilation was a form of colonization. Amina approached her privately to say she loved America, but Omar looked at her like she was a traitor. According to the witness, Omar whispered that she could be American on paper, but her loyalty must remain with Somalia. Johnson asked if there was documentation, and Amina produced a recording she made at a fundraiser after becoming suspicious. Omar's lawyer shouted that the recording was illegal, but Johnson overruled him, citing state consent laws. The audio played, capturing Omar's voice, clearly stating that America is just a place to work. The recording ended, and the silence that followed signaled the death of her political defense. After dismissing the witness and hearing from others, Johnson turned back to Omar, whose defiance had vanished. He opened the final yellow binder and brought up the topic of her citizenship and the oath she took. He read the oath aloud, emphasizing the section about renouncing all allegiance to foreign princes or states. When asked if she meant it, she snapped that of course she did. But Johnson pointed to the contradictions. He asked why she told foreign ministers and constituents that her first loyalty was to Somalia if she had truly renounced it. He argued those statements and her sharing of classified intelligence were the exact opposite of bearing true faith and allegiance. He asked if she took the oath freely or with a mental reservation, saying words she did not mean to get a passport. Despite her lawyer's objections, Johnson declared that the evidence suggested she never actually renounced her allegiance. He stated this constituted citizenship fraud, which was grounds for denaturalization, deportation, and removal from Congress. Omar looked terrified, realizing for the first time that she might face prison and the loss of her country. Johnson formally announced immediate referrals to the Department of Justice for prosecution under the Espionage Act. He also referred her to intelligence agencies for the revocation of her security clearance and to immigration services for fraud investigation. He suspended her from committee assignments and recommended a full House vote on her expulsion within 30 days. Omar tried to protest that he could not do this, but he replied that he just did. He closed the binder and returned to the simple question he had asked at the very beginning. After 7 hours of evidence, he asked again which side she would want to win in a war between the U.S. and Somalia. It was no longer a trick but a final test, and the room held its breath waiting for her response. She opened her mouth, but realized she could say neither America nor Somalia without incriminating herself. She sat in silence, and in that silence, her career effectively came to an end. Johnson noted the refusal to answer, banged the gavel, and adjourned the hearing, leaving her alone at the table. The cameras captured a woman who had thrown everything away because she could not decide which country was home. Johnson walked out like a professional lawyer who had finished a case, while Omar remained pinned to her chair. Her lawyer was already packing up, distancing himself from the inevitable radioactive fallout of the hearing. The supporters in the gallery were quiet, having witnessed not a protest, but an autopsy of their hero's career. It was impossible to chant slogans after hearing her describe America as merely a workspace. Omar finally stood and tried to leave with dignity, but the press looked at her with cold appraisal rather than friendship. Entering the hallway, she was hit by a wall of sound as reporters demanded to know if she would resign. She pushed through the mob to her office, but the 60-second clip of her silence was already viral. It had been viewed millions of times, playing on screens across the Capitol and in living rooms everywhere. The audio of her calling America a workspace was looping on cable news, betraying her oath in high definition. Political isolation occurred instantly, with her usual allies in the squad remaining silent or claiming they hadn't seen the evidence. Democratic leadership issued a brief statement supporting a full investigation, which was essentially a death sentence for her career. Back in her darkened office, her staff was crying and shredding papers while angry constituents rang the phones. She looked at a photo of her swearing-in ceremony, realizing she had viewed it as a victory rather than a contract. She had tried to serve two masters, and today the breach of that contract was exposed for the world. 3 weeks later, the House convened for a rare vote to expel her, and the mood was somber. The volume of evidence had removed any oxygen for partisan defense, forcing even progressives to abandon her. The final vote was a landslide, with many Democrats joining Republicans to repudiate her actions. She tried to give a defiant speech, but the chamber was already emptying, and nobody was listening. The sergeant-at-arms collected her pin, stripping her of her title, her office, and her power. 2 days later, the Department of Justice unsealed a federal indictment listing counts of espionage and fraud. It laid out the timeline of wire transfers and classified leaks, serving as a roadmap to prison. Immigration Services simultaneously opened proceedings to revoke her citizenship based on the fraud proven by her own statements. In Minneapolis, her district did not riot, but instead experienced a quiet and determined reclamation. The witnesses formed a new group dedicated to American values, declaring they did not come here to be a colony. Amina Hassan told the crowd that Omar was wrong to say they had to choose between heritage and home. They chose the Constitution and the country that saved them, shaking off a leader who used them as props. 6 months later, Omar sat in an apartment awaiting trial, watching a former Marine win her vacant seat. She realized she had been fighting an internal war for 20 years, wanting American power without giving it her heart. The lesson was that one cannot be a traitor to the oath. It is a blood pact that demands total loyalty. This story serves as a stark warning to anyone who believes the oath of office is merely words. Johnson destroyed her not with insults, but with the undeniable truth she had tried to hide. Loyalty is not divisible when the stakes are high, and Ilhan Omar found that out the hard way. If you believe representatives must put their country first, share this story and subscribe for more revelations. The filing cabinet is deep, the truth is coming, and nobody is above the oath.